Whenever you hear about the unemployment rate on the news, it's so easy to just see it as another statistic, another number flashing on the screen. But behind that single percentage point are millions of real people with real stories. It's one of the most powerful signals of our economy's health, and it impacts everything from our own wallets to the very fabric of our society. So, here's how we're going to break it all down. We'll kick things off by looking at the real-world impact of this number. Then we'll get to know the four main faces of unemployment. After that, we'll dig into some other key categories, talk about what the goal of full employment actually is, and wrap up with some practical steps we can all think about.
All right, first up, why does this one little statistic carry so much weight? Well, because its effects ripple out way beyond just one person looking for a job.
And that brings us to a really crucial question. The cost of someone losing their job isn't just about a lost paycheck. The true costs run so much deeper, and they touch pretty much every part of our lives. It's like a massive chain reaction, right? For an individual, yeah, it's lost wages and your skills might get a little rusty, but it's also the anxiety, the stress. That stress then spills over into families. For companies, it means spending more on hiring and training, and it can be a real hit to team morale. And if you zoom out even further, the entire economy feels it. Less consumer spending, less tax money coming in. It can even contribute to bigger societal problems.
So to really get into this, we have to start with the official definition. The key phrase here, the one you absolutely need to remember, is actively looked for a job. If you haven't been looking in the last 4 weeks, you're not officially counted as unemployed. That's a huge distinction.
We all remember seeing headlines with jaw-dropping numbers like this one from April 2020. It was a clear, unmistakable sign that the economy was in shock. But here's the kicker. Even a number that high doesn't actually tell you the whole story. Nope, that's because the official rate, the one you always hear about, which is technically called the U3 rate, is just one of 6 different ways the government measures what it calls labor underutilization.
So check this out. U3 is the big one, the official rate. But look what happens when you start adding people back in. U4 includes discouraged workers. Those are people who've just given up looking for a job. And then you get all the way down to U6, the broadest measure. It adds in all the people working part-time who are desperate for a full-time gig. This U6 number, this gives you a much more honest, real-world picture of how the job market is actually doing.
Okay, so now that we know how unemployment is measured, let's talk about the why. It turns out not all unemployment is created equal. Let's meet the 4 main types. First up, we have frictional unemployment. Think of this as the natural in-between phase of the job market. It's people leaving one job to find a better one. Or maybe it's recent grads searching for their very first position. Honestly, in a healthy, dynamic economy, you're always going to have this. It's not a bad thing. Harriet is a perfect example. She isn't unemployed because there's something wrong with the economy. Nope, she's just taking the necessary time to find the right fit for her career. This is actually a sign of a market with plenty of opportunities. Okay, next up is structural unemployment, and this one is a much bigger deal. This is what happens when the very structure of the economy fundamentally changes. Think about new technology making old jobs obsolete, or entire industries packing up and moving overseas. The problem here is a deep mismatch. The skills people have no longer fit the jobs that are actually available. And Roberto's story, man, this is a classic and unfortunately an increasingly common example. His job didn't disappear because of a bad economy. It was literally replaced by a machine. This kind of unemployment can be devastating and long-term. It forces people to go back and learn entirely new skills just to get back into the labor market. Third on our list is cyclical unemployment. This is the one you probably hear about most often. It goes up and down with the business cycle. When the economy tanks and we hit a recession, people buy less stuff, so companies make less stuff. And then they have to pay people off. This is the kind of unemployment governments try to fix with things like stimulus packages. And finally, there's seasonal unemployment. This one is pretty predictable, right? Think about farm workers after a harvest or a ski instructor in the middle of July. Their jobs are directly tied to a specific time of year. So we've got the big 4 down, but economists have a few other ways they classify joblessness to get an even clearer picture of what's happening in the labor market.
The really crucial point here is that you can have a job and still be in a really tough spot. I mean, look at underemployment. That's the engineer who's working as a barista to make ends meet, or the person who desperately needs 40 hours a week but can only find a 10-hour gig. And as you can see, there are also bigger institutional forces at play, like government policies, that can affect the job market. So, after hearing about all these different types of unemployment, you're probably asking, well, what's the goal then? Should we be aiming for 0% unemployment? Well, believe it or not, the answer is no. The actual goal for a healthy, functioning economy is what's called the natural rate of unemployment. This is the point where the only joblessness left is frictional and structural. The normal churn of people switching jobs and industries evolving. Essentially, cyclical unemployment is at zero. And that natural rate, it translates to a real number. Most economists figure that for the US, full employment actually means an unemployment rate somewhere between 4 and 6%. It's not zero, because in a vibrant, changing economy, you want people to be able to move around and find better jobs. Now, as you can probably guess, economists don't all agree on how to manage this. On one side, you have Keynesian thinkers. They worry that if unemployment gets too low, it could spark inflation, and they generally believe government should step in during bad times. On the other side, you have classical economists who tend to argue that inflation is really about the money supply, and they put more emphasis on individual workers needing to adapt and learn new skills. Okay, so we've covered a ton of theory. Let's bring this all back home. What does this mean for us as individuals trying to build a career? What can we actually do? It really all boils down to being proactive, making sure your boss knows the value you bring, being the person who's flexible and willing to learn new things, and constantly keeping an eye on where your industry is headed so your skills stay relevant. These are your best defenses against all types of unemployment. And of course, networking is always, always key. And this brings us to one final big thought to leave you with. We saw how technology created structural unemployment for Roberto, the cashier. But as AI and automation continue to accelerate at a mind-bending pace, what is that going to look like in 20 years? How will this powerful force completely redefine our economy and maybe even change what we think of as a job in the first place? That's the billion-dollar question we're all going to have to figure out together.